A term limit is a legal restriction that limits the number of terms an officeholder may serve in a particular elected office. When term limits are found in presidential and semi-presidential systems, they act as a method to curb the potential for monopoly, where a leader effectively becomes president for life. This is intended to protect a democracy from becoming a de facto dictatorship. Sometimes, there is an absolute limit on the number of terms an officeholder can serve, while, in other cases, the restrictions are merely on the number of consecutive terms. History. Ancient term limits have a long history. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome, two early civilizations which had elected offices, both imposed limits on some positions. In ancient Athenian democracy, only offices selected by sortition were subject to term limits, where it was possible to serve 2 one-year terms. Non-consecutively elected officers were all subject to possible re-election, although they were minoritarian. These positions were more prestigious and those requiring the most experience, such as military generals and the superintendent of springs. In the Roman Republic, a law was passed imposing a limit of a single term on the office of censor. The annual magistrates, tribune of the plebs, aedile, quaestor, praetor, and consul, were forbidden re-election until a number of years had passed. Also, there was a term limit of 6 months for a dictator. Many modern presidential republics employ term limits for the highest officers. The United States placed a limit of 2 terms on its presidency by means of the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution in 1951. There are no term limits for vice presidency, representatives and senators, although there have been calls for term limits for those officers. Under various state laws, some state governors and state legislators have term limits. Formal limits in America date back to the 1682 Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties, and the colonial frame of government of the same year, authored by William Penn and providing for triennial rotation of the provincial council, the upper house of the colonial legislature. The Russian Federation has a rule for the head of state that allows the President of Russia to serve more than 2 terms if not consecutive. For governors of federal subjects, the same 2-term limit existed until 2004, but now there are no term limits for governors. Term limits are also common in Latin America, where most countries are also presidential republics. Early in the last century, the Mexican revolutionary Francisco Madero popularized the slogan "Sufragio efectivo, no reelección." In keeping with that principle, members of the Congress of Mexico cannot be re-elected for the next immediate term under Article 50 and 59 of the Constitution of Mexico, adopted in 1917. Likewise, the President of Mexico is limited to a single 6-year term. This makes every presidential election in Mexico a non-incumbent election. Countries that operate a parliamentary system of government are less likely to employ term limits on the leaders. This is because such leaders rarely have a set term at all. Rather, they serve as long as they have the confidence of the parliament, a period which could potentially last for life. Many parliaments can be dissolved for snap elections, which means some parliaments can last for mere months while others can continue until their expiration dates. Nevertheless, such countries may impose term limits on the holders of other offices in republics. For example, a ceremonial presidency may have a term limit, especially if the office holds reserve powers. Term limits may be divided into 2 broad categories: consecutive and lifetime. With consecutive term limits, a legislator is limited to serving a particular number of years in in the particular office. Upon hitting the limit in one office or chamber, a legislator may run for election to the other chamber or leave the legislature. After a set period of time, the clock resets on the limit, and the legislator may run for election to his her original seat and serve up to the limit again. With lifetime limits, once a legislator has served up to the limit, he may never again run for election to that office. Lifetime limits are much more restrictive than consecutive limits. Notable examples: